Darius Wycliffe didn't even look up from his desk when he said it. He just kept writing pen, scratching across paper, calm as a man signing a dinner receipt while Gideon Hartley stood across from him, hat crushed between both hands, legs barely holding. The farm, the animals, the tools in the barn. Wycliffe turned a page. All of it by Friday. Gideon's voice cracked. My daughter she has nowhere. There is one alternative. Wycliffe finally looked up. And he smiled. The Blackwood man. Up on Frostveil Ridge, he set his pen down like he was doing them a favor. She marries him. Debt disappears. Simple arithmetic. 19 years old. A stranger, a mountain nobody had seen in years. If that were your daughter, what would you do? If this kind of story reaches something in you, stay with us. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Elowen Hartley's life ended the first version of it. Anyway, the sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming yet. That pale, sick purple that sits over the mountains before the real cold arrives. She was pulling water from the well when she heard her father's horse coming up the trail at the wrong pace. Too fast. The kind of fast that means something has already gone wrong and the rider is only now catching up to it. Gideon Hartley was not a dramatic man. He'd buried his wife 12 years earlier without making a sound at the graveside that Elowen could remember. He'd lost a whole harvest to root blight 2 seasons back and handled it by picking up a second axe job. So when Elowen saw him slide off that horse and grab the fence post with both hands just to stay upright, she dropped the bucket entirely. The water spread dark across the frozen ground. Papa, she was already moving. What happened? It wasn't a question. She already knew, some animal part of her, that what came next was going to require her to be very still. He told her in pieces. The way broken things come apart not all at once, but in a sequence that takes a moment to understand as collapse. Wycliffe's bank had called the loan, the full sum. Not the remaining installments. The whole thing. Immediately, on the grounds of a clause buried in language Gideon had never had the schooling to fully parse when he'd signed it 3 years prior. The farm was forfeit, the animals, the equipment. The house Elowen's mother had planted climbing roses along the south wall of roses that still came back every spring, stubborn and particular, the same shade of pink they'd always been. All of it gone before winter, Elowen sat down on the fence rail and didn't speak for a long time. Not because she was soft, because she was doing arithmetic. She was 19, and she was doing the kind of arithmetic that most people don't have to face until they're much older. The kind where no matter how you arrange the numbers, the answer keeps coming out the same. They had nothing. They would have nothing, and winter was 6 weeks out. He said there was one option, Gideon told her. He wouldn't look at her when he said it. He was staring at the roses, already frostbitten at the edges. He said Ronan Blackwood, up on the ridge. Wycliffe said the man needs a wife, and that he stopped, pressed his fist against his mouth. I told him no, I want you to know I told him no. But you came back here, Elowen said. I came back here, her father agreed. She asked him what he knew about Ronan Blackwood. He told her what the town said, which was mostly rumors, the kind that grow in the absence of facts the same way mold grows in the absence of light. That he was violent, that he'd gone mad after something happened on the mountain years back, that he was scarred. People said that, though nobody she could find had actually seen him in years, that the timber lodge up on Frostveil Ridge was the kind of place you didn't come back from. She listened to all of it, then she stood up, picked the bucket off the ground, and went back to the well. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for exactly one night. Not because it was an easy decision, because she understood, somewhere she didn't love admitting, that it wasn't really a decision at all. It was a trap that had been shaped to look like a choice, and the only power she had left was in how she walked into it. She did not cry. She came close, once, around 2 in the morning, lying in the room she'd slept in since she was 7, looking at the water stain on the ceiling that she'd always thought looked like a running fox. She felt something enormous move through her chest and press against the back of her throat, and then she swallowed it. Put it somewhere below her ribs, not gone, just stored, because there wasn't time for it. In the morning, she told her father yes. He wept. She held his face in her hands until he stopped, the way he used to do for her when she was small, and the world had done something unkind to her. "This isn't your fault," she told him, "Elowen. It isn't." She made her voice flat and certain. "Wycliffe did this. You understand that?" He nodded, but she could see he didn't quite believe it. He was the kind of man who absorbed blame like cloth absorbs water quietly, completely, until he was saturated with it. She filed that away. She would deal with it later, when she had room. For now, she had to go meet the man she was being sold to. The wedding happened on a Thursday. She wore a dress that had been her mother's. It didn't fit quite right in the shoulders. Her mother had been narrower, more careful in her proportions, but it was the best thing she owned, and she was not going to marry a stranger in something that felt like surrender. The dress felt like armor, even if the armor was slightly large. Wycliffe attended. Of course he did. He stood at the back of the small church, in a coat that cost more than her father's farm tools combined, and he watched the whole thing with the satisfied expression of a man watching an investment mature. He didn't pretend to be happy for them. He didn't pretend anything. He just watched and smiled to himself occasionally, and Elowen could feel the back of her neck prickle every time she caught him in her peripheral vision. Ronan Blackwood stood at the front of the church and did not fidget. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He was tall and roughly assembled, the kind of man who looked like he'd been put together for function rather than aesthetics, with wide shoulders that strained slightly at the fabric of a jacket that was clearly not worn often. His face was well. The town had said scarred. There was a mark that ran from his left jaw upward. Not monstrous, not dramatic. Just there, the way old damage becomes part of a face rather than an interruption of it. He wasn't looking at her when she came down the aisle. He was looking at the floor. She wasn't sure if that was courtesy or something else. When he did look up, his eyes were gray. Not cold gray. Just settled, like stone underwater. Like something that had been in one place so long it had stopped feeling the pressure of staying there. He didn't smile. She didn't either. The preacher spoke quickly. The whole thing lasted under 20 minutes. When it was done, Ronan put his hand briefly under her elbow to guide her out, not gripping, barely touching, like he was offering assistance rather than claiming anything, and she thought, Redwater Crossing had exactly 14 people witness it. Most of them watched with the specific, barely concealed fascination of people watching something they expect to go badly. Mrs. Caldwell from the dry goods store was already crying, which Elowen found both touching and unhelpful. Her father hugged her for a long time at the door. "The debt," she said quietly into his shoulder. "He's signed the papers already." "It's done." His arms tightened. "I'm sorry, girl." "Stop apologizing," she told him. "Help me instead." She pulled back before he could ask what she meant. She wasn't entirely sure herself yet, but she filed the instruction away for herself as much as for him. The ride up to Frostveil Ridge took the better part of 4 hours. Ronan didn't talk much. He asked, about 40 minutes in, whether she was cold. She said no. He nodded. Another half hour went by. He asked if she'd eaten before the ceremony. She said she'd had some bread. He said there would be food at the lodge and left it at that. She watched him instead of the landscape. She'd gotten very good at watching people. Without appearing to, it was a skill she'd developed young, as the child of a man who felt everything loudly and needed someone nearby who was paying close attention without making it obvious. She watched the way Ronan held the reins, not tight, not careless, the moderate grip of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and trusted his hands to know what they were doing without his brain's involvement. She watched his jaw. Whether it tensed, it didn't. He wasn't performing calm. He just was calm, or something close enough to it that the distinction wasn't immediately apparent. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd prepared for a man who would be difficult to manage. She'd spent the whole previous night mentally cataloging strategies, things she'd read, things she'd observed, ways to be useful enough to be safe and invisible enough not to threaten. She had a whole architecture of survival built up inside her head. And here was this man who had offered her a blanket without being asked, who was riding at a pace considerate of the fact that she hadn't been on a horse in months, who had said 12 words to her in 4 hours, and none of them had been threatening. She didn't trust it, but she catalogued it. When the lodge came into view, she understood, at least in part, why he hadn't left. The ridge itself was the kind of landscape that does something to a person. She'd expected wilderness, and what she got was something more particular than that. Timber stands so thick with old growth that the light came through them changed, amber green, specific. A creek running along the north property line that she could hear before she could see. A view of the valley below that opened up as they crested the final approach. Redwater Crossing reduced to its correct size, the way all the things that loom large tend to look from high enough up. The lodge was large, needed paint in places. The porch railing had been repaired more than once. She could see the different ages of the wood in the grain, but solid, built to last by someone who'd intended to stay. She walked in behind him and took stock. Fireplaces. Thick-hewn furniture. A kitchen that was larger than she'd expected, with cast-iron pans hung in a row and dried herbs bunched at the window. It smelled like pine resin and something older, like a house that had once been full and wasn't anymore. On the wall of the main room, there was a child's drawing, framed, sided mountains in green crayon, a stick figure at the top. She looked at it for only a moment, then looked away. Ronan led her down a hallway and stopped at a door. "Your room," he said. "The lock works from your side. I had the fire set already. It's been going a few hours. Should be warm enough." She looked at him. "My room," she repeated. "I don't know what you were told," he said, and there was something careful in his voice. Not unkind, just precise. "But I'm not. This arrangement isn't. I needed the debt cleared and Wycliffe needed something, and that's the extent of what this was supposed to be." He looked somewhere near her shoulder rather than at her face. "I'm not going to pretend that's a comfortable thing to say, but I'd rather say it than not." She was quiet for a moment. "The lock works from my side," she repeated. "Yes. And yours? There's no key on my end." He met her eyes briefly then. "I built this house. I know where the weak walls are. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel safe. I'm telling you so you know I know them, and I'm still telling you the lock works." Key from the door. Turned it over in her palm. "All right," she said. He nodded. "Breakfast is at 6 if you want it. If you don't, that's fine too." And then he was gone down the hallway, quiet on those heavy boots, the way large men sometimes move when they've spent years trying not to disturb things. Elowen went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. The room was clean. There were extra blankets folded at the foot of the bed. On the small table there was a candle, already lit, and beside it someone had placed a cloth-wrapped parcel that turned out, when she opened it, to contain 2 pieces of cornbread and a small jar of honey. She stared at the cornbread for a long time. Then she ate both pieces. Then she lay back on the bed, fully dressed, stared at the ceiling, and let herself feel afraid for exactly 10 minutes because she'd earned it, counted in her head. At the end of 10 minutes, she sat back up, turned the key in the lock until she heard the bolt slide home, and began thinking about what exactly Darius Wycliffe needed badly enough that he'd engineered all of this to get it. Because a man like that didn't do anything for simple reasons. He hadn't cleared her father's debt out of generosity. He hadn't arranged a marriage out of neighborly concern. There was something on this mountain he wanted, and whatever it was, she was going to find it first. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall on Frostveil Ridge, soft and steady, covering over everything, the way certain kinds of danger always do before you know to look for it. Elowen didn't sleep for a long time, but when she finally did, her hand was still loosely curled around the key. She wasn't letting go of it. She found the ledgers on a Wednesday. It was her 11th day on Frostveil Ridge, and she had spent most of those 11 days doing 2 things simultaneously, making herself useful enough that Ronan wouldn't think to watch her, and watching everything. She'd learned the house's rhythms quickly. Ronan was up before light, always. She could hear him in the kitchen, not loudly. He moved through spaces with a kind of deliberate economy, like a man who'd spent years learning not to take up more room than necessary. He'd have coffee made by the time she came down, and he'd pour her a cup without asking, and he wouldn't say much, and she found she didn't mind the quiet because it wasn't hostile. It was just his, the way certain silences belong to certain people. He spent his days in the timber operation. He had 2 men who came up from the valley 3 days a week, brothers. The petty boys, early 20s, who called Ronan sir without irony and worked without complaint. She'd watched them from the kitchen window. Ronan worked alongside them, not above them. When one of the brothers, the younger one, caught his hand on a saw blade and split 2 fingers open, Ronan was the one who wrapped them, not carefully, but effectively, with the focused bluntness of someone who'd done field doctoring before. He wasn't what the town had said, but there was a door at the end of the upstairs hall that was always locked. She'd noticed it on the second day. She didn't ask about it, filed it. The ledgers weren't in the locked room. They were in the study on the ground floor, in a cabinet beneath the desk that wasn't locked, just closed, the kind of closed that assumes nobody's looking. She hadn't been snooping, precisely. She'd been looking for paper to write a letter to her father, and she'd opened the wrong cabinet, and there they were. She almost closed the cabinet again. She genuinely almost did. But the top ledger had a name on the first page that she recognized. Wycliffe Land and Loan Holdings. She sat down on the floor of the study, right there on the cold boards, and she began to read. It took her 3 hours. She read slowly because she wanted to understand, not just skim. And what she understood by the end of those 3 hours made her sit very still, with her hands flat on her knees and her jaw set so tight it ached. The numbers in that ledger were not Ronan's numbers. They were Wycliffe's, or rather, they were records of what Wycliffe had done to Ronan. Loan terms that had been modified after signing. Interest calculations that didn't match any legitimate formula she'd ever seen her father struggle through. A deed transfer that had been initiated, then apparently contested, then gone quiet for reasons the ledger didn't explain. And running through all of it, like a thread you could follow if you knew to look, was the same manipulation she recognized from her own family's situation, the deliberate, patient inflation of a debt that had never been as large as it was made to appear. Her father's debt, the farm, the Friday deadline, all of it had felt sudden when it happened. But sitting on the floor of Ronan's study, reading these pages, she understood that sudden was an illusion Wycliffe manufactured. He had been building this for years. She heard Ronan's boots on the porch. She put the ledger back exactly where she'd found it, closed the cabinet, stood up, and was at the kitchen counter slicing bread by the time the door opened. Her hands weren't shaking. She was mildly proud of that. He came in, knocked the snow off his boots, hung his coat. He looked at her once, the way he always did a brief, functional check, the way you look at a window to see if it's still intact. Then he went to wash his hands. She set the bread on the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up from the basin. "How long have you been dealing with Wycliffe?" The stillness that went through him was different from his regular stillness. Smaller, more internal, like a door being very quietly shut somewhere behind his eyes. "Why?" he said. Not a question, a checkpoint, because I found the ledger in the study cabinet. The one with his name on it. She held his gaze. "I wasn't looking for it, but I read it." He dried his hands on the cloth by the basin. His time. Then he pulled out the chair across from where she was standing and sat down heavily, the way tired men sit, not with drama, just with the full weight of themselves. 3 years, he said. "The debt he has on this property is not what it should be." "Yes." His voice was flat, not angry. The kind of flat that comes after anger has burned through and left only the char. "I know that. I've known it. I have a lawyer in Millhaven I've been corresponding with. But the man is—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "Cautious. He says the language in the original deed is complicated. He says proving manipulation requires documentation that Wycliffe controls. He doesn't control all of it," Elowen said carefully. Ronan looked at her. "There are things in that ledger that he didn't write," she said. "Things that were written about him. Calculations that someone on your side wrote down to track the discrepancies." She paused. "Who kept those records?" He was quiet for a moment. Clara did, he said. The name sat in the room between them. She recognized it not because she knew who Clara was, not yet, but because of how he said it. The specific, compressed way people say the names of the dead. She didn't ask. Not then, she let it settle. Those records might matter, she said instead. If someone knew how to use them. You're 19 years old, he said. Not cruelly, just stating it the way you'd state the weather. I know, she said. I'm also the only person in this house who isn't tired yet. He looked at her for a long time. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not warmth. Not exactly, more like recalibration. The look of a man revising an assumption. Eat something, he said finally. It's getting dark. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. She sat down across from him, and they ate bread and cold venison in the particular quiet that had become, without either of them planning it, theirs. She thought about the locked door upstairs while she ate. She thought about the name Clara. She thought about what Wycliffe needed badly enough to manufacture a marriage. She didn't say any of it aloud. There was time. She had decided there was time, and she intended to use it. She found out about the railroad on a Saturday, and the way she found out was almost embarrassingly accidental. She'd gone into Redwater Crossing with Ronan to collect supplies her first time back in town since the wedding. She'd been braced for it, the way you brace for something unpleasant that you've been told is coming. And it was unpleasant. Mrs. Caldwell was kind in a pitying way that made Elowen's back teeth press together. Two women she'd known her whole life crossed the street rather than greet her, which told her everything she needed to know about where the town had placed its sympathies. A man she didn't recognize at the feed store looked at her with frank, evaluating curiosity that made her feel like something in a display case. Ronan noticed. She could see in her peripheral vision his jaw tighten. He stayed close, not touching her. Not hovering. Just within a few feet. The way a man plants himself in a room when he wants it understood that he's paying attention. She appreciated it more than she expected to. The information about the railroad came from an argument she wasn't meant to hear. She'd stepped into the narrow space between the general store and the co-op ridge to wait while Ronan loaded the wagon, and two men came around the far end of the alley without seeing her surveyors. She figured from the equipment on their belts. Arguing in the clipped shorthand of professionals who've been working together too long. The ridge route is still the problem, one of them said. Northern parcels are squared away. Southern is done. But if that center section doesn't transfer by spring, the whole route angles east, and that adds 8 miles minimum. Wycliffe said it's handled. Wycliffe's been saying that for 18 months. Well, it better actually be handled this time. The company isn't extending again. They moved past, and she pressed herself flat against the wall and let them go, and then she stood very still for a moment and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature move through her chest. The ridge route, the center section, Frostveil Ridge. She made herself walk, not run, back to the wagon. Ronan was securing the last of the load, and he looked at her face when she climbed up, and she could tell he saw something there because his hands slowed on the rope. What happened, he said. Not here, she said quietly. When we get back, he didn't push, he didn't ask questions on the drive up. She was grateful for that. She used the time to lay the facts out in her own mind in the right order, the way you organize a wound before you start treating it, not because order makes it hurt less, but because losing your head makes it worse. When they were back at the lodge and the horses were settled and the supplies were in, she told him what she'd heard. She watched his face while she told him. It was mostly still. But his left hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist and didn't open again until she'd finished. The railroad, he said. They need Frostveil Ridge to complete the route. Wycliffe's been acquiring properties around it for years. You said yourself the surrounding parcels have been changing hands. She stopped. You knew. I suspected, he said, which was different, and she could see he knew it was different. I suspected there was something he wanted badly enough to be this persistent. I didn't know it was the railroad specifically. He arranged our marriage, she said. And she said it plainly, because plainly was the only way to say it that respected what it actually was. so that if something happened to you, I'd inherit the property. And then if I disappeared or was pressured into a sale. He owns the bank, Ronan said. He'd manufacture a debt on the inheritance. He'd own the ridge inside of a year. The word we sat between them for a moment, unspoken but present. He needs us separated or gone, she said, both of us. Ronan got up and went to the window and looked out at the timberline for a long time without speaking. She let him. There are families in this valley, he said finally, without turning around, who've lost property to him in the last decade. The Sorensens lost their mill. The Abrams family, they had 80 acres of bottom land, prime soil, and their loan terms changed 3 months after they signed. The widow Marsh, she had stopped. I tried once. I went to the county recorder, and I said there's a pattern here. And they sent me to the circuit judge, and the circuit judge had a very friendly relationship with the Wycliffe Bank. He turned around then, and his face was the kind of tired that isn't about sleep. I've been fighting this alone for 3 years, and it's gotten me nowhere. Because alone, I'm just a man on a mountain that a banker wants to buy. Elowen looked at him. You're not alone anymore, she said. He looked back at her. She could see him measuring it, whether to believe it, whether it changed anything, whether it was something she was saying because the situation required it, or because she meant it. She meant it. She wasn't entirely sure when that had happened. You'd need more than the ledger, he said. I know. I'd need testimony. Multiple people willing to put their names to what Wycliffe did. She paused. Let me write to my father first. He knows people in this valley, farmers, merchants, people who've been squeezed. He'll know who might talk and who won't. And if Wycliffe finds out you're gathering, then he'll have made a mistake, she said, because right now he thinks I'm a frightened girl he dropped on a mountain to wait. The moment he comes after me for asking questions, he's proved he has something to hide. Ronan was quiet, then quietly, You're not what I expected. No, she agreed. I know. The locked door opened on a night when the wind was bad enough that neither of them slept well. She hadn't asked him to open it. She wasn't sure she would have. But she was up at 2 a.m. because the wind was doing something to the north eave that made the whole upper hallway sound like it was breathing wrong, and she'd come out to check that no shingles were pulling. And she found him already in the hall, standing in front of the locked door with a key in his hand and not doing anything with it. He heard her. He didn't startle. Men like Ronan didn't startle, but he turned and looked at her in the low lamplight, and she could see from his face that something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong that has a practical fix. I'm sorry, she said, meaning for the intrusion. The wind was, it's all right. His voice was rough in the way voices get at 2 a.m. I come here sometimes, when it's bad weather. He looked at the key in his hand. Old habit I used to check on. He stopped, looked at the door. Clara used to say the storm scared her less when she knew I'd checked. She didn't say anything. She waited. He unlocked the door. He didn't go in. He just unlocked it and pushed it open, and she understood that this was not an invitation to follow. It was just him not hiding it anymore. She looked from the doorway. It was a child's room. Small bed with a hand-carved frame. A window with fabric curtains, white with small yellow flowers, faded now. A shelf with books and a cloth rabbit and a tin painted like a barn. On the floor near the window, a small pair of boots, placed carefully, toes together, as if someone had just stepped out of them and would be back. Maeve, she said softly, because she'd worked it out by then, the pieces of it. She was 4, he said, the mine collapse, I wasn't there. I was up on the ridge. Clara had taken her to see there was a mining operation in the South Valley. Her brother worked it. She wanted the girl to see where her uncle worked. His voice had gone to something almost mechanical, the tone of a man who has told this story to himself so many times that the telling has worn smooth. They never found all of Clara. They found enough of Maeve to bury. Elowen stood at the threshold of that small room and felt something enormous and awful move through her, the kind of sorrow that doesn't belong to you but lands on you anyway. I'm so sorry, she said. I kept the room, he said, because I didn't know what else to do with it. And then after a while, it seemed like if I changed it, I was saying it was over, that they were really gone and not just, he stopped. Looked at the small boots on the floor. I know that doesn't make sense. It makes sense, she said. It makes sense. He pulled the door closed again gently, locked it, put the key in his shirt pocket. They stood in the hall for a moment in the lamplight, and the wind was still going at the eave, but it didn't seem as loud now. The orchard land on the eastern section, he said suddenly. There's 7 acres I cleared 2 summers ago. I was going to plant apple trees. Clara wanted. He stopped, shook his head a little. I never did it. I got the seedlings once, and then I let them die. Couldn't. He made a small gesture that might have meant anything. She thought about those 7 acres. She thought about dead seedlings. She thought about what it costs a person to stop halfway through a thing they'd started with someone else, and whether the stopping is the grief or the grief is just the reason for the stopping. I could plant it, she said, if you wanted, in the spring. He looked at her in the dim hallway. You know apple trees, he said. My mother grew them, she said, along the creek on our property. I know enough. He didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. And she had learned in 11 days that with Ronan Blackwood, the absence of refusal was its own kind of language. She went back to her room. He went, presumably, wherever he went when the nights were bad. She lay in her bed with her hand loosely around the key out of habit, and she thought about Maeve's boots placed toe-to-toe on the floor. And she thought about Wycliffe standing in the back of that church with his investor's smile. And she thought about her father's face when he told her the farm was gone. And she thought about the 2 surfers arguing in the alley about a railroad that needed one particular piece of land to be obtained before spring. Something was becoming very clear to her, not just the shape of what Wycliffe had done, the full extent of it, the years of it, the deliberateness. He had looked at her family and seen leverage. He had looked at Ronan and seen an obstacle. He had looked at a dead woman's grief and at a dead child's father and seen an opportunity. He had arranged all of it, and he was sleeping fine down in Redwater Crossing in his large house, while Ronan stood in a hallway at 2 a.m. holding a key he couldn't make himself use. And while her father was staying where, exactly? Because the farm was gone. Her father had nowhere to sleep tonight. Where was Gideon Hartley sleeping? She sat up. She'd been so consumed by survival that she hadn't finished the thought. Where was her father? She got up and went to the small writing desk and wrote a letter to him by candlelight, long and specific. She asked for his new address. She told him she was all right in careful, true language that was also strategic. She didn't want him to worry, but she needed him functional. She told him to think about other families in the valley who'd had trouble with the bank. Think carefully. Make a list if he could. She sealed the letter and set it by her boots to take to the post the next time they went to town. Then she sat at the small desk for a while longer, in the middle of the night, on a mountain that a railroad company needed for its route, in a marriage arranged by a man who'd counted on her being too frightened to ask questions, and she thought about what it meant to be someone's last piece. Wycliffe had been patient for years. He'd moved slowly, methodically, absorbing property after property, shaping debt into a tool. He was very good at waiting. She was beginning to understand for the first time what it might mean to be better at it than he was, because Wycliffe had made a specific, unrecoverable error when he'd put her on this mountain. He'd looked at her and seen a 19-year-old girl with no resources, no allies, and no options. He'd seen someone who would shrink, who would be scared enough to be managed and isolated enough to be forgotten. He had not seen someone who would spend her first 2 weeks reading his ledgers, listening at alley walls, and making friends with a man who had nothing left to lose. He had not seen Elowen Hartley. That was going to cost him. Outside, the wind finally broke, and the night went quiet in the abrupt way mountain weather does, as if someone had simply decided to stop. And somewhere in the silence from down the hall, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard. Ronan, still awake, still moving through his own house at night, in the particular way of a man who has learned that stillness and sleep are not the same thing. She blew out the candle. In the morning, she'd start making a list of her own. The letter from her father arrived 3 weeks later, and it was longer than anything Gideon Hartley had written in his life. He was staying with his brother-in-law, a man named Pose, in a one-room addition behind a feed barn 2 miles outside Redwater Crossing. He was fine, he said, which Elowen read as meaning he was not fine but was functional, which was enough. He'd been asking around, quietly, the way she'd requested. The list he'd compiled filled the back of 3 pages in his careful, labored handwriting. Names she recognized. Names she didn't. Families from the North Valley and the South Reach, and even 2 from the mining district east of Millhaven. She read that list at the kitchen table, while Ronan sat across from her with his coffee, not reading over her shoulder, just present in the way he'd gotten into the habit of being present when she was working through something. It had become, without announcement, a kind of partnership. She'd bring him what she found, and he'd tell her what he knew, and they'd sit with it together until the shape of it made sense. It wasn't graceful, they disagreed sometimes. He had a tendency to think in terms of what was provable, and she had a tendency to think in terms of what was true, and those weren't always the same thing. And they'd argued twice about it, real arguments with raised voices, and both times she'd been the one to walk out of the room first, because she had enough self-knowledge to recognize when she was about to say something she'd regret. Both times he'd had coffee waiting when she came back. He never said anything about it. She never said anything about it. But it had started to feel like a code she was learning. There are 14 families on this list, she said. 14 that we know of from one man asking quietly in one small area. Ronan, if even half of these people are willing to come forward. Coming forward is different from being willing, he said. Wycliffe holds mortgages on 3 of those names. I know for a fact he holds the note on the Sorensen mill. They say one wrong word and they lose everything. They're losing everything anyway, she said slowly. That's how he works. He doesn't take it all at once. He just squeezes and squeezes until there's nothing left. He was quiet. He knew she was right. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way it was the quiet of agreement rather than the quiet of resistance. I want to go see some of these people, she said. He looked up. Not all of them. Not yet. But there are 2 or 3 on this list, the widow Marsh, and a man called Aldous Briggs who lost a grain operation 2 years back. They've already lost everything. Wycliffe has nothing left to hold over them. They might talk. You'd be going into town, into Wycliffe's territory. It's everyone's town, she said. He just acts like it isn't. Ronan set his cup down. He rubbed the edge of his thumb along the table grain, a habit she'd noticed he had when he was working through something he didn't want to say. I'll come with you, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He picked the cup back up. I want to. She looked at him for a moment. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have known what to do with that sentence. She was still working out what to do with it now. All right, she said. Thursday. They went on Thursday. The widow Marsh first, because she was closest, and because Gideon's note said she was sharp and had a temper, which in Elowen's experience meant she was somebody who'd been angry for a long time and just needed somewhere to put it. Lavinia Marsh was 62 years old, small and tightly built, with white hair she kept pinned severely and eyes the color of creek mud after rain. She opened the door of her boarding house, a 3-room operation she'd been running since her husband died, which was the last thing Wycliffe hadn't managed to take from her yet, and looked at Elowen, and then at Ronan, and then back at Elowen. So you're the girl he married off, she said. Yes, ma'am, Elowen said. Can we come in? Lavinia stood aside. Her front room smelled like boiled coffee and old wool, and there were papers everywhere, stacked in a kind of aggressive organization that suggested the owner knew exactly where everything was and would be furious if anyone touched any of it. They sat. Lavinia didn't offer coffee, which Elowen noted as a kind of test. She sat across from them with her hands folded and her chin slightly elevated and waited. Elowen told her what she'd found. Not everything. She was careful about what she showed and what she held back, because she'd learned quickly that information was currency, and spending it all at once was how you ended up broke. She showed her enough, the ledger pages she'd copied out in her own hand, the discrepancy calculations, the deed transfer timeline. Lavinia looked at the papers for a long time. My husband's freight operation, she said finally. He'd built it for 20 years. Wycliffe took it in 1881 on the grounds of an outstanding debt that my husband swore he'd paid. He had the receipt. Wycliffe's man said the receipt was a forgery. Her jaw was very tight. My husband died 8 months later. His heart. She folded the paper back along the original crease with a sharp, precise movement. I know it was his heart, but I also know what broke it. We need testimony, Elowen said. Written, signed, with whatever documentation you have. Even partial documentation helps. We're trying to build something large enough that it can't be ignored. By who? Lavinia said. The circuit judge that Wycliffe has dinner with every other month? There's a territorial investigator office in the capital, Ronan said. It was the first time he'd spoken since they'd sat down, and both women looked at him. If we can build a case large enough, multiple victims, documented pattern, forged records that's not a county matter anymore. That's territorial. Wycliffe's dinner arrangements don't reach that far. Lavinia looked at him with something that shifted from skepticism toward something more careful. Ronan Blackwood, she said, as if saying the name properly for the first time. I've heard things about you, I know, he said. Most of them bad. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the largest stack of papers on the table beside her and withdrew a folder so fat it had been tied shut with string. I've been keeping records since 1880, she said, setting it on the table between them. Every conversation, every letter, every discrepancy I could find. I always thought if enough people, she stopped, pressed her lips together. I've been waiting a long time for enough people. Elowen looked at that folder and felt something shift in her chest, relief and grief mixed together in the specific way they get when something you've been hoping for turns out to be real. She reached out and put her hand briefly over Lavinia's. You're not waiting anymore, she said. Lavinia looked at her hand. Then she went and put the kettle on. Aldous Briggs was a different situation. He was a large man, gone soft at the edges, living in the back of a cousin's property in a situation that was clearly temporary in the way things are temporary when there is no plan for them to change. He met them at the property line, and he didn't look either of them in the face when he said he couldn't help them. I've got 2 boys, he said, talking at the fence post. Wycliffe's got a note on this property, my cousin's. If I make noise, if Wycliffe goes to prison, Elowen said, the notes go with him. Everything he manufactured, it all comes apart. And if he doesn't, Briggs looked at her then. His eyes were the kind of tired that has been tired for a long time. What happens to my cousin's 40 acres? What happens to my boys? She didn't have an answer. She wanted to say something strong and certain, and she didn't because she respected him too much for that. I understand, she said. I do. I'm not going to pretend this is without risk. I just need you to think about what it costs to stay quiet, too. Wycliffe doesn't stop. He never has. Your cousin's 40 acres, she paused. How long before he finds something to use? Briggs stared at the fence post for a long time. Give me a week, he said. Let me think on it. She gave him the week. She gave him her word, too, which she knew was worth less than a document, but more than nothing. That if he came forward, she'd make sure his name was part of a group so large that singling him out for retaliation would look like exactly what it was. On the ride back up the mountain, Ronan said, You're good at this. She glanced at him. At what? At talking to people in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're being managed. She thought about that. My father, she said after a moment. He felt things very loudly, and he needed people around him to be steady. I learned how to be steady. Is it hard being steady? Sometimes, she said. Not usually while I'm doing it. Usually later, when there's nothing requiring it anymore. He nodded slowly. She got the sense he understood that in his own way. People who held themselves very still for long periods, she'd noticed, shared that particular quality, the deferred cost of it. They rode the rest of the way in the companionable quiet that had become their default, and she looked at the ridge line ahead and thought about how it had felt like a prison sentence 25 days ago and now felt like not home, not yet. Maybe not quite that, but something that was building toward something. A place where things were becoming clear. Wycliffe found out on a Friday. She didn't know how. She had ideas the boarding towns were small and people talked, and Wycliffe had spent years being the kind of man who paid for information the way other men paid for groceries, casually and regularly, and without thinking much about it. By the time she found out that he knew, he had already moved. She found out from the Petty brothers. The younger one, whose name was Cale, came up the mountain at a run on a Friday morning, which was not his scheduled day, and he looked pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He told them that Wycliffe had called in alone on the property of a man named Ferris, a farmer 3 miles south of town who'd given Elowen written testimony the week before. Called the whole sum, immediately, same as he'd done to Gideon, and that Wycliffe had sent a man to tell Mrs. Marsh that the building code on her boarding house had been found non-compliant and the building would need to be vacated while inspections were conducted. She stood in the yard and listened to Cale tell her this and felt something cold move through her that she recognized as fear, and then she felt it move through her and come out the other side as something harder and more functional. "He knows," Ronan said. "He knows," she agreed. "And he's burning the witnesses. We don't have enough yet. I know we don't have enough yet." She was already thinking. Her mind had a quality when she was scared that she'd never particularly liked. It got very fast and very narrow, tunneled in on the problem, and everything else fell away. She'd thought of it as a flaw until right now. We need what we have secured somewhere he can't reach it. All the copies, all the testimony, and we need to move faster. "Elowen, I have to go into town." She was already turning toward the house. "I have to get to Lavinia before his men do. Her folder that documentation goes back to 1880. We cannot let him." "You can't go alone." Ronan's voice was flat, not a suggestion. She stopped, turned around. He was standing in the yard with his arms loose at his sides and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he'd already decided. "Then come with me," she said. They left in 20 minutes. She rode faster than she usually did, and he matched her without comment. She got to Lavinia's boarding house at midday. Lavinia already knew someone had come by an hour before, one of Wycliffe's men, and delivered the building inspection notice in the tone of someone who enjoyed delivering notices. Lavinia had showed him the door, and then, because she had apparently been preparing for exactly this kind of move for a long time, she retrieved the folder from where she kept it and had it ready. "I knew eventually he'd do something like this," she said, pressing it into Elowen's hands. "That's why the real copies aren't in this building." Elowen stared at her. "What?" "I have copies at my sister's in Millhaven. I've been sending copies there for 2 years, one letter at a time." A small, hard satisfaction moved across Lavinia's face. "He can burn this building down if he wants. He won't get the documents." Elowen felt something that was almost a laugh, startled out of her. "Mrs. Marsh, I'm 62 years old," Lavinia said crisply. "I've had a long time to be patient." They were still standing in the front room, working out the next steps when the door opened. Darius Wycliffe walked in like he owned the building, which, technically now, he was in the process of claiming he did. He was alone, which surprised her for a moment, and then she realized it wasn't confidence, it was calculation. He'd come without visible muscle because he wanted this to look like a conversation. He was tall, well-kept, with the particular grooming of a man who spent money on himself the way other men spent money on practical things. He looked at Elowen first, then at Ronan, who had come in behind her and was standing near the wall in the way large men stand in rooms when they are very deliberately not making themselves a threat. Then at Lavinia. "I had hoped," Wycliffe said, "to speak with Mrs. Hartley privately." "Blackwood," Elowen said. "My name is Blackwood." He smiled. It was an excellent smile. She hated it with a specificity she hadn't felt before. "Of course. My apologies." He clasped his hands in front of him. "I heard you've been making some inquiries around town." "Talking to some of my former clients. Talking to your victims," she said. The smile didn't change. "That's a strong word. It's the right word. I've read the ledgers, Mr. Wycliffe. I've seen what you do to the loan terms after people sign. I've seen the forged receipt records and the manufactured inspections, and the way you time the calls so families can't liquidate fast enough to meet them." She kept her voice level. This was where being steady mattered most, not for her own sake, but because she needed him to hear the words without the distraction of her emotion. You've been doing it for years. To my father. To this woman. To 14 other families that I know about, and probably more that I don't. Quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. Somewhere on the street, a horse was unhappy about something. You're very confident for someone with very few allies, he said. And even fewer legal resources. I have documentation. Documentation can be challenged. Not when it goes back to 1,880 and includes records from multiple independent sources. She watched his face for the small movement that would tell her whether Lavinia's copies in Millhaven were something he knew about. She didn't see it, which meant he didn't know, which meant they had something he hadn't accounted for. And not when it's in the hands of people who aren't in your county anymore. There it was, a very small tightening around his eyes. Gone in a second. Here is what I'll offer you, he said, and his voice had changed. Still pleasant, but the pleasantness was load-bearing now. The debt on Frostveil Ridge cleared, permanently. Your father's situation resolved. Whatever you need for the next 5 years, comfortably. In exchange, he paused, as if the pause made it a negotiation rather than what it was. In exchange for the documents and your public statement that any previous concerns were based on a misunderstanding. The room was very quiet. Lavinia made a sound that was not a word. Elowen looked at Wycliffe and thought about Gideon in a one-room addition behind a feed barn. She thought about Maeve's boots on the floor. She thought about Lavinia's husband and his broken heart. She thought about the name Ferris, the farmer he'd gone after the moment he'd found out, the one he'd chosen to hit first because it would send a message. No, she said. Wycliffe's smile came back, but it was different now. Smaller and not warm. I thought you might say that. He picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it. I hope you understand that this conversation was your last easy opportunity. Was that a threat? Ronan said. He said it very quietly from his place near the wall. Wycliffe glanced at him. It's a statement of fact. I don't threaten people, Mr. Blackwood. It's inefficient. He settled his hat. Good afternoon, he left. The door closed. The three of them stood in the silence he'd left behind. Then Lavinia walked to the window, watched him go, and said, without turning around, he's going to move faster now. Yes, Elowen said. What do we do? Elowen looked at Ronan. He was already looking at her. In his face she could see what she thought she probably looked like, not calm, exactly, but something that had moved past the point where panic was an option. The look of someone who has passed through their own fear and come out the other side of it still standing. We move faster, she said. What happened in the next 10 days was later the part she could remember least clearly. It had the quality of an illness, the details blurred, but the feeling stayed. She wrote letters every night, sometimes past midnight, drafting testimony requests and evidentiary summaries in one very careful, very precise letter to the territorial investigator's office in the capital, signed by both her and Ronan, outlining the pattern of fraud they'd documented and requesting an official inquiry. She sent it through Lavinia's contact in Millhaven rather than through the local post, which she no longer trusted. Ronan went to the territorial land office and filed a formal challenge to the deed modification. Wycliffe had attempted in 1882. The clerk there was a young man who had no relationship with Wycliffe and processed it with bureaucratic indifference, which was exactly what they needed. Aldous Briggs came back. He showed up at the Ridge on a Tuesday, unannounced, with his signed testimony in his hand and a look on his face like a man who'd made a decision that scared him, but that he'd made anyway. She thanked him. He said, "Don't thank him yet." Wycliffe moved against the Petty brothers' employer, a timber merchant in town who happened to hold a note with the bank, and the brothers were let go. Cale came up the Ridge and told them. Ronan hired them directly the same day, which he'd apparently been considering for a while, because he had the paperwork already half-drafted, and Elowen saw that and felt something that she didn't immediately have a word for. She was trying to find the word when the trouble really started. She'd gone into town alone. She knew, afterward, that she should have told Ronan she was going, not because she needed his permission, but because two people are harder to intercept than one, and she'd known Wycliffe was getting desperate. And she'd underestimated what desperation does to a man who has spent years believing he is untouchable. She was at her father's temporary address. She'd been there 20 minutes, going over his testimony with him, making sure the dates were right when the door opened without a knock, and 2 men came in who did not live there. Giddison stood up. One of the men put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down without much effort. The other one looked at Elowen with the flat eyes of someone doing a job, not enjoying it, just doing it. "Mr. Wycliffe wants a word," he said. "Mr. Wycliffe knows where I live," she said, which was calm and also completely useless. They took her to Wycliffe's estate. Not roughly, there was no roughness, which in some ways was worse because it meant he was confident. She was put in a chair in his study and offered tea, which she declined. And then Wycliffe came in and sat across from her and looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of patience, but is still maintaining the form of courtesy. "I want to be very direct with you," he said. "That would be a change," she said. He didn't react to that. "You've been causing difficulties." "I respect the effort, I genuinely do. But you have to understand," he leaned forward slightly. "The judge in this territory processes about 300 case filings a year. Priority goes to matters of significance. A complaint from a mountain woman with a handful of copied ledger pages and some disgruntled farmers." He made a gesture. "These things take years to process, if they're processed at all. Meanwhile, accidents happen. Properties deteriorate. People find their situations becoming very uncomfortable. You want me to convince Ronan to sign over the ridge," she said. "I want you to be practical. I want you to understand what fighting me actually costs, over time, for everyone you care about." She sat in that chair and looked at Darius Wycliffe, and she thought about the letter she'd sent to the territorial investigator's office. The one that had gone through Millhaven, the one he didn't know about. "I'll think about it," she said. She said it in a tone that she hoped sounded like capitulation. She wasn't sure it did, but it was enough to get her back in the wagon, back on the road toward the ridge, and that was what mattered. She was halfway up the mountain road when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Ronan coming down at speed. He'd figured it out, she didn't know how. Maybe one of the Petty brothers had seen something. Maybe Gideon had gotten word up, but he came down the road with his jaw set and his eyes scanning, and when he saw her, he pulled his horse up so hard the animal protested. He looked at her, up and down, making sure. "I'm all right," she said. "You went alone," he said. "I know, I told you." "I know, Ronan." She met his eyes. "I know, I made a mistake. I won't do it again." He held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw was still tight, but the worst of whatever had been on his face was ebbing. "What did he say?" he said. "He wants me to convince you to sign the ridge over." "What did you say?" "I told him I'd think about it." She watched his expression. "I'm not thinking about it. I needed to get out of that house." He was quiet. Then he turned his horse to ride back up alongside her. "What I want to know," he said after a few minutes, "is how he found out about the testimony gathering." "We were careful. Not careful enough," she said. "Or someone talked. Or he's had someone watching the house. Any of those means he's running out of options. Desperate men do desperate things," she finished. "Yes, I know." She looked up at the ridge ahead, the tree line dark against the late sky. "We need to move faster than I thought." Elowen, his voice was different. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. "If this goes wrong, if we can't, it's not going to go wrong," she said. She didn't know if that was true. She needed it to be true, so she said it. But if it does, she thought about it for a real moment. Not the automatic reassurance, the actual consideration. "Then at least we made it difficult for him," she said. "At least there are 14 families with signed testimony in Millhaven who know what he did. At least that exists. Whatever happens, that exists." He nodded slowly, still looking at the road. "I need you to trust me," she said. He glanced at her. Something moved across his face that was complicated and private, and then it settled. "I already do," he said. "That's the part that worries me." They rode up the mountain in the last light of the afternoon, and behind them, in Redwater Crossing, Darius Wycliffe was figuring out that she hadn't meant it when she'd said she'd think about it. She could feel it, the way weather feels before it arrives. Something was coming. She didn't know the shape of it yet. but she was done being surprised. The storm came 3 days after she got back from Wycliffe's estate, and it came the way bad storms always come in the mountains, with a false gentleness first, light snow and a quieting of the wind, as if the weather were trying to seem harmless before it committed to what it actually intended. Elowen noticed the barometric change in the way her ears felt at noon. She'd grown up close enough to the mountains to know that sign. She told Ronan. He looked at the sky for about 4 seconds, and then went to make sure the horses were doubled up in the stable, and the timber operation was secured. He sent the Petty brothers down the mountain before the light changed. He did all of it without being asked, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had weathered this specific ridge for years and knew its temper. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full, and it was bad. The kind of storm that makes a solid house feel provisional. Wind like something with a grievance against walls. Snow so dense the lantern light from the window reached maybe 4 feet before it gave up. They sat by the main fireplace. Harlan Creed was there. Harlan had arrived 2 days earlier, which was not unusual. He came up to the ridge every few weeks on the pretext of discussing the timber operation. And Ronan trusted him the way men trust people who have been quietly reliable for long enough that the trust has stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a fact. He was 68, heavyset, with a gray beard he kept short and hands that were slightly too large for the rest of him. He had a quality she'd noticed from the first time she met him of listening more than he spoke, and of making people feel, when he did speak, that he'd been thinking about it for a while. She'd liked him immediately. She'd also, from the second week, suspected he was not entirely what he presented himself to be. Not in a dishonest way. In the way of someone who had a room in themselves they kept the door closed on. That night, with the storm pressing against the walls, and the three of them arranged around the fire with what remained of a dinner, none of them had finished. Harlan set down his coffee cup and looked at both of them and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Ronan looked up. Elowen set her own cup down. Harlan rubbed his hands on his knees in a gesture that she'd come to associate with him choosing words carefully. "I wasn't only a timber foreman," he said. "Before I came to this valley, before I came to work for Ronan, I spent 11 years as a territorial investigator. Out of the capital office, land fraud, deed manipulation, bank corruption." He paused. "I was good at it." The fire popped. Outside, the wind did something to the north eave that she'd stopped finding alarming. "Why?" Ronan said. And the word had an edge she recognized, not anger, not yet, but the thing that precedes anger in a man who feels he's been managed. "Because I came here following a lead," Harlan said. He was calm. He'd clearly expected this reaction and had decided to go through it rather than around it. A pattern out of this valley property transfers, debt manipulation, the same signatures on altered documents it showed up in Capitol records 3 years back. I was already retired from active service, but an old colleague asked me to take a look, informally. So I came. I took the job with your operation because it put me close to the situation." "Close to me," Ronan said. "Yes, and you didn't say anything." "Because I had nothing that would hold," Harlan said. "Not yet. I had a pattern and a hypothesis and 4 years of careful observation, and no document that a court wouldn't let Wycliffe's lawyers eat alive." He leaned forward. "I need you to understand I know what I did. I know how it looks. But I also know that if I'd come to you with half a case, Wycliffe would have known within a week, and everything I'd built would have been gone. And you'd have been in a worse position than before." Ronan was very still, the kind of still that was doing work. "How long?" he said. "How long have you been watching?" 4 years, Harlan said. Ronan got up and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room. Elowen watched him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was processing it. 4 years. Harlan had been in this house, at this table, at this fire, and he'd known things and not said them. She understood the anger. She also understood what Harlan hadn't said yet. "What do you have?" she said. Both men looked at her. "You said you had a pattern and no document that would hold." Then she showed up. She gestured at herself, and it felt slightly absurd, but she kept going. "And we've been gathering testimony and documentation for weeks. You've been watching that happen." She looked at Harlan directly. "So what do you have now?" Harlan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put a leather folder on the table between them. Enough, he said, or close enough that what you've gathered from the Valley families is the piece that makes it close enough actual. He opened the folder. She leaned forward. Inside were documents she didn't recognize, not copies she'd made, not letters from Lavinia or Briggs or her father. These were different, older, cross-referenced in a way that showed systematic, patient work. Transaction records from the Capital Land Office, a sworn statement from a former bank clerk, signed and notarized, describing instructions he'd received from Wycliffe to alter loan documentation. A detailed timeline mapping 14 property acquisitions against their corresponding debt calls, showing, in numbers that would be very hard to argue with, that the debt calls preceded Wycliffe's acquisition offers by an average of 11 days. She went through it page by page. Ronan came back from the window and stood behind her left shoulder and went through it with her without sitting down. "It's real," she said. "Not a question, it's real," Harlan said. "And the clerk who signed that statement is currently at his daughter's home in the Northern Territory, outside Wycliffe's reach." He paused. "But it needs the local testimony, multiple victims their own words. What you've been building. Without that, it's a capital investigator's file and a single witness. With it, it becomes a pattern so large that even a sympathetic judge can't wave it away." Ronan sat down heavily in his chair. "You should have told me," he said. He said it quietly, which was worse than if he'd been loud about it. "Yes," Harlan said. He didn't argue. He just said yes and let it sit there. The fire burned. Outside, the storm was working itself toward its worst. "Can we get this to the territorial office?" Elowen said. "I have a direct contact there, a man I worked with for 8 years. He's been waiting for this package." Harlan looked at her. "The moment the storm breaks, I ride to Millhaven and send the full case by secure post. It shouldn't take more than 2 weeks for a response, given what I've told him to expect." 2 weeks, Ronan said. "Could be less. And in 2 weeks, Wycliffe." "Wycliffe knows he's running out of time," Elowen said. She'd been thinking it since Harlan had started talking. "The testimony gathering, the land office challenge, me refusing his offer, he knows. He's not sitting in that estate waiting to see how this develops." She looked at Harlan. "What does a man like that do when he knows the window is closing?" Harlan's expression told her she'd asked the right question and wasn't going to like the answer. "He tries to eliminate the problem," he said, quickly. "Before the paperwork gets where it's going." The word eliminate sat in the room with the weight of a thing that is being said plainly for the first time, but that everyone has been thinking around the edges of. "Then we need to move the documents tonight," she said. "Not wait for the storm to break. If he's watching this place, and I think he is, I think he has someone who comes up this road and reports, then the moment the weather clears, he knows we might move. We'd be moving in the window he's expecting. Moving in a storm like this could kill a man," Harlan said. "I know, but he won't be watching the storm. Nobody's on that road tonight." "That's exactly why." She looked at Ronan. He was looking at her. She could see him working through it, the risk calculation, the same arithmetic she was running. She could also see, and she was not going to say this aloud, that he was afraid. Not for himself. She'd figured out in the weeks since the locked door that Ronan didn't spend much energy being afraid for himself. But for other people, for her specifically, in a way that had grown from a vague protectiveness into something more particular and more present. "Harlan goes tonight," Ronan said, "not alone. Cale Petty's brother knows this road better than anyone in the valley. He grew up on the South Slope." "I'll send word the documents," Elowen said. "Harlan carries copies. The originals stay here, secured." Ronan looked at Harlan. "You have a contact in Millhaven who can hold the packet securely?" "Colleague's wife. She's been holding materials for me for 3 years. Trustworthy in the way that people who have lost things to corruption tend to be trustworthy." Ronan nodded. Something had shifted in his face. The anger at being managed was still there. She could still see it, but it had been subordinated to the immediate practical problem the way his anger usually was. He was not a man who let his feelings run the room when the room needed something from him. "You and I will talk," he told Harlan, "after this is done." "I know," Harlan said. "I'll be here." They spent the next 40 minutes preparing the packet. Harlan's documents. copies of the Valley testimony, the ledger analysis, the deed timeline. Elowen worked at the table while the storm howled, and Ronan helped her organize the sequence in a way that would be immediately clear to someone receiving it cold. She'd never done anything like this before, constructing a legal case, ordering evidence for presentation, and she found that she was surprisingly good at it, which she suspected said something about her she'd examine later. Harlan left at 11 o'clock into the storm, with the documents in an oilskin packet inside his coat and the Petty brothers' eldest son riding ahead of him. She and Ronan stood on the porch and watched them go until the darkness and the snow took them. Quiet that followed was strange. Storm was still loud, but inside the house, a different kind of stillness had settled, the kind that comes after a significant thing has been done that can't be undone. They went back inside. She put more wood on the fire. He poured 2 cups of the coffee that had been sitting so long it was more or less molten, and she drank it anyway because her hands wanted something to do. 4 years, he said. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, looking at the middle distance. He was trying to help you, she said. I know that. He picked at the edge of his cup. I also know that for 4 years I thought I was alone in this, and I wasn't. And that's... He stopped, shook his head. It's a complicated thing to find out. She understood that. She understood it more than she said. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. When Wycliffe first started coming at the ridge, the first time you realized what he was doing, what did you do? He was quiet for a moment. Tried to fight it alone, he said. Went to the county recorder. Went to the judge. Got nowhere. He looked at the fire. And then I just held on. Kept the operation running. Kept the debt from defaulting. Waited for something to change. A pause. Nothing changed for 3 years. And then Wycliffe sent me, she said. And then Wycliffe sent you. She looked at her coffee. He thought he was using me as a mechanism to get access to the inheritance, to manufacture the last step of the acquisition. She turned the cup in her hands. He looked at me and saw a tool. I know what he saw, Ronan said. It wasn't what was there. She glanced up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her. His face in the firelight had the particular quality of someone who'd said something honest and was now hoping it would be received in the spirit it was offered and not examined too closely. She let it rest. You should sleep, she said. If this goes the way we're hoping, the next 2 weeks are going to require both of us to be functional. I won't sleep, he said, not self-pityingly, just as information. I know, she said, neither will I. They sat by the fire for a long time without talking. The storm moved through its worst around 2 in the morning and then began slowly to release. She watched the quality of the silence change through the window, the snow thinning, the wind easing degree by degree. Sometime past 3, she realized Ronan had fallen asleep in the chair. He was sitting slightly forward, the cup still loosely held in one hand, his head inclined at an angle that was going to cause him neck pain in the morning. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had held a mountain for 3 years by sheer stubbornness, who had kept a locked room as the only indulgence he allowed himself in all the years of solitary grief, who had told her the lock worked from her side on the first night, and then kept every door open after that. She took the cup out of his hand without waking him and set it on the hearth and went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time. They arrested Wycliffe on the 15th day. She almost missed it. The territorial officers arrived in Redwater Crossing on a Thursday morning, 4 of them, with warrants that had come from the capital office at a speed that told her Harlan's contact had been waiting for this packet the way a man waits for something he's been promised for years. They went to the bank first, then to the estate, and they were professional and methodical, and Wycliffe was in custody before most of the town knew what was happening. She found out from Cale Petty, who came up the mountain at a run with the kind of energy that is entirely involuntary. The energy of someone who has been holding a thing inside them and finally has someone to give it to. She sat down on the porch steps when he told her. Just sat down. She hadn't planned to. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. Ronan came out a few minutes later and she told him, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he went and sat down beside her on the steps, which was something she registered, that he sat beside her and not across from her or behind her. It's not over, she said. Because she knew it wasn't. No, he agreed. The network he built, the people in the county who were working with him, the judge who was friendly, the clerk who was covering the altered records. I know. And the families, even if the fraudulent debts are canceled, even if the properties get returned, that takes time. Legal process. Meanwhile, people are Elowen. He said her name in the tone that meant he was going to say something he'd decided was necessary. One thing at a time, she looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. Her mind had a tendency, in moments of relief, to immediately locate the next problem, as if it distrusted relief and needed to justify ending it. One thing at a time, she repeated. She meant it this time. The sun was on the ridge, and the snow from the storm had settled, and the timber operation was making its usual sounds. And somewhere below them, Redwater Crossing was absorbing the fact that Darius Wycliffe was in handcuffs. It lasted 4 days. He escaped custody on a Monday. She found out in a letter, a terse, furious letter from Harlan, who had been in Millhaven coordinating with the Capitol office, and who had received the news from his contact before anyone in the local territory had officially processed it. The word he used was escaped, but what the letter described was more clinical. A transport transfer that had been inadequately managed. A sympathetic deputy who had looked the wrong way at the wrong moment. The particular vulnerability of a man who has spent 30 years building relationships with exactly the kind of people who manage transport transfers. She read the letter at the kitchen table. Ronan was in the timber yard. She sat with the letter for about 30 seconds, and then she got up and went outside and called to him. He read it standing up. She watched his face. "He's coming here," Ronan said. "Yes," she said. "He has nowhere else to go. His network is being dismantled. His bank is frozen. His estate is being searched." She'd thought it through on the walk from the kitchen. "We are the only problem he has left that he thinks he can still solve directly. He'll have men with him, probably whatever loyal ones are left. Fewer than before." She looked at the tree line. "We need Harlan back here, and we need to be ready." Ronan was already heading for the stable. "I'll send the petty boys to get Harlan," he said over his shoulder, "and I'm going to move the horses to the upper pen. If they come at night and the horses are accessible." "The documents," she said. "Whatever copies we still have in the house, we need to get them off the property. Even if he burns this place, we need the case to survive." Ronan stopped, turned around. "He's not going to burn this place," he said. And she could hear in his voice that this was not bravado. It was the simple commitment of a man who has decided where the line is and means it. "Ronan, Clara built half this house," he said. "Maeve took her first steps on this porch." He looked at the lodge. At the porch railing with its different ages of wood, at the kitchen window with the herb bunches hanging. "He's not burning it. Not while I'm standing." She looked at him. She thought about the locked room. She thought about the child's boots placed toe to toe. "Then we make sure you stay standing," she said. He nodded. Brief. Then he went to the stable, and she went back inside to figure out what needed to be moved and what needed to be ready. Harlan arrived back on the ridge the following evening, and he wasn't alone. He'd brought Gideon. Her father climbed down from the wagon, and she crossed each other for a moment without speaking. He felt thinner than she remembered. He smelled like the cold and like the particular soap he'd always used, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder the way she had when she was very small, before she stepped back and looked at him. He looked older. The last months had done something to his face that couldn't be undone. But his eyes were clear, and when he looked at her at the lodge, at the ridge, at Ronan crossing the yard toward them, she could see him absorbing it, trying to match what he'd imagined with what was actually here. "You look well," he said. His voice was slightly unsteady. "I am well," she said. It was true in all the ways that mattered. Ronan shook Gideon's hand. There was a moment between them that she watched carefully, her father taking the measure of this man, this large and quiet stranger his daughter had been given to, looking for what the town's rumors had said and finding something different. "Thank you," Gideon said, for keeping her." "She doesn't need keeping," Ronan said. He said it plainly, no edge to it, simply as a statement of what he'd observed. "She's been keeping both of us." Gideon looked at her. She saw in his face that some particular and specific weight had shifted. Not gone, not yet, but moved. They got everyone inside, and Harlan laid out what he knew. Escape, the timeline. His contact at the Capitol office had marshals prepared to re-engage the moment Wycliffe surfaced, but the territory was large, and a man with money and remaining allies could move faster than official process. "He'll come in the night," Harlan said. "That's how men like this move when they've run out of other options. The storm gave us a preview. He'll use weather if he can. Or he'll wait for the small hours. We're not leaving the ridge," Ronan said. "I didn't suggest it. What did you suggest?" Harlan looked at him. "I suggest we're not surprised. I suggest we know what we're walking into before it walks into us." That night, she helped Harlan go through what remained of the documents in the house, the originals, the ones they'd kept back. She wrapped them in oilskin, double, and Harlan put them in a lockbox he'd brought from Millhaven, and they put the lockbox in the root cellar under the kitchen, behind 3 years of stored provisions, in a spot that would require someone to know it was there to find it. Her father stayed. She'd thought he might want to, or that she'd have to convince him to, but he said quietly that he wasn't leaving, and that was that. He was not a brave man in the physical sense. She knew that. She loved him as he was, but he had a loyalty that ran deep enough to make him more useful than fear. The Petty brothers stayed too. Nobody asked them to. They just didn't go down the mountain when the day ended. She lay awake that night. They all did. She thought all of them awake in different rooms, doing the particular arithmetic of people waiting for something they know is coming, but can't put a time to. Around 2 in the morning, she heard Ronan moving in the hall. She got up and came out, and he was at the top of the stairs, looking at the front door. "Nothing yet," he said, without turning. "You should rest." "You should rest," he said back, which was the same conversation they'd had several times before. She went and stood beside him. They stood at the top of the stairs looking at the front door for a while in the low lamplight. "After this," he said quietly, "the orchard land." "You said in the spring." She was quiet for a moment. "I meant it. I know." He was still looking at the door. "I want you to plant it. I want you to." He stopped. "Try it again. I want it to be yours, not a project. Not something you do because it's useful. I want it to be yours." A pause. "I want you to have something here that nobody can make into currency again." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the door, but she could see the line of his jaw, the particular tension of a man saying something true and hoping the delivery is adequate. "Ronan." He looked at her. She didn't have a clean way to say it. She wasn't built for clean ways. "I stopped wanting to leave," she said. "I'm not sure exactly when, but I stopped." He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight at the top of the stairs. Something in his face that was complicated and careful, and underneath all of it, something she recognized because she'd been feeling it herself for weeks, the slow, slightly inconvenient arrival of something real. He reached out and briefly, barely, touched the back of her hand with 2 fingers. Not a grip, not a claim, just contact. The way you touch something you want to make sure is actually there. Turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while. At the top of the stairs, in the small hours of the night, waiting for whatever was coming. Outside the ridge was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't last. She knew it didn't last, but she held on to it anyway, the way you hold on to the last of something good when you know that what comes next is going to require everything you have. They came before dawn. She heard them first, not the men themselves, but the horses. The particular sound of animals being held too still on a cold road. The small involuntary noises they make when riders are asking them to be quiet. She'd grown up around horses. She knew that sound. It was the sound of people trying to arrive unheard. She sat up in the dark and pressed her palm flat against the wall between her room and the hallway, the way she'd gotten into the habit of doing, and she listened. Ronan was already moving. 2 rooms away, boots on the floor, deliberate and unhurried. Harlan, too, from the room at the end of the hall. They'd all been sleeping in that particular shallow way that isn't really sleep, just the body resting while the mind stands watch. She'd done a lot of that in the past weeks. She suspected she'd be doing more before this was finished. She dressed in the dark, pulled on her boots. She'd laid out everything she might need the night before warm layers, the small knife she'd started carrying in the third week. On the ridge, the oilskin packet of the most critical documents that they'd kept out of the cellar for fast access. She'd thought carefully about what to carry if they had to move. It was the kind of thinking that felt morbid until the moment it became necessary, and then it felt like the most sensible thing she'd ever done. She came into the hall. Ronan was at the top of the stairs, rifle in hand. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the east tree line. She understood. Riders coming up the secondary trail, the one the timber operation used for hauling. They knew the property's back route. Someone had told them. Harlan appeared behind her, already dressed, his own rifle loose in his left hand. The softness of an aging foreman was gone from his face. What was underneath it was harder and more practiced, the particular stillness of someone who had done this before, who knew the difference between situations that could be talked down and situations that had already passed that point. "How many?" she whispered. "Enough," he said, which wasn't an answer, but she understood it meant more than 2, and possibly as many as 6, which meant they had a problem regardless of the count. Gideon came out of the small back room. She crossed to him quickly and put her hand on his arm, not gently, firmly, the way you take hold of something you need to be still. "Stay back," she said, "not because you can't help. Because if something happens to both of us, there's no one left to carry the testimony forward. The case needs a witness who isn't involved in whatever happens tonight." He looked at her with the expression of a man who wants to argue and knows he's going to lose. "I'm not hiding while my daughter—" "You're not hiding. You're protecting something more important than either of us right now." She held his gaze. 12 families worth of evidence, Lavinia's 12 years of records. Everything Harlan carried from the capital. If we lose that, we lose everything. You're protecting that. That's not a small job. He pressed his mouth into a line. Then he nodded. She squeezed his arm once and let go. He went back into the small room. She heard the chair go under the door handle. Good. Downstairs, Ronan had put out the lamps. The lodge was dark except for the banked fire, which threw just enough light to see shapes. She came down the stairs and positioned herself beside the front window, close to the wall, and looked through the narrow gap in the shutter. She could see 3 men at the edge of the yard, 2 more moving along the south side of the building. And beyond them, at the top of the approach road, a figure on horseback that she recognized by posture alone, the particular upright quality of a man who had spent 30 years making sure people in rooms looked at him when he entered. Wycliffe, then his voice came through the walls. Blackwood. A pause. Wind moving through the timber. "I know you're in there. Come out and we settle this between us and nobody else gets hurt." The specific phrasing of a man who has already decided that somebody is getting hurt. Ronan said nothing. Elowen looked at him. He shook his head once. She agreed. Responding was giving him what he wanted, which was to know exactly where in the building they were. "The woman too," Wycliffe said. His voice had changed slightly, still carrying, still controlled, but with something under the control that she recognized as a man whose composure is load-bearing rather than genuine. He was holding himself very carefully together. "Both of you walk out now, and your people leave without trouble. He's going to burn it regardless." Harlan said, very quietly, close to her ear. That was always the plan. He didn't come up here to negotiate. He came up here to make sure there's no one left to testify. She'd been thinking the same thing. A man with nothing left to protect was not the same as a man with nothing left to lose. A man with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous, because consequence had stopped being a factor somewhere on the road up the mountain, and what remained was just the accounting of a wounded ego and 30 years of impunity coming to their last defense. "What do we do?" Ronan said. He set it to both of them, which was something she noticed even in the middle of it. "The back kitchen door," she said. "The woodyard. If we can get to the east slope before they—" "They're at the woodyard," Ronan said. 2 men. I saw them move while he was talking. He was at the opposite shutter. He put people at every exit before he called out. He's done this before, or he paid someone who has. She took a breath, counted what they had. 2 rifles, one between Ronan and Harlan. The knife in her boot, the oilskin packet, A lodge that was surrounded on 4 sides by men who'd been positioned deliberately, and Gideon in the back room who couldn't be put in a direct line of fire. The numbers were not good. She was aware of this without letting it become the loudest thing in her head, because the loudest thing in her head right now needed to be useful rather than accurate. Then the smell came through the walls. Even before the sound of it, the particular chemical sweetness of lamp oil, the cheaper grade, the kind you bought in quantity when you needed a lot of it fast. She'd smelled it before, on the timber operation, on long cold nights when the work lamps needed filling. She'd never smelled it from outside a building she was standing inside. "He's lighting it," Harlan said, and then the fire took the back wall. It was nothing like she'd expected. There was no gradual creep, no warning buildup. There was a sound like the building inhaling wrong, a concussive push of heat through the kitchen, and then the crackle of something structural engaging and the orange pulse of it visible under the kitchen door. 10 seconds, maybe less, from the smell to the reality. "Up," Harlan said. He was already moving. "East window. Off the roof pitch onto the slope. Go." She moved. The oilskin packet against her chest, one hand pressed flat to it through her coat. Up the stairs, which were already warm from below, the heat of the fire talking up through the floor. Ronan behind her, Harlan ahead, moving with a capability that reminded her he'd been a field investigator for 11 years, and field investigators didn't spend all their time behind desks. They went down the upper hall, past the locked door. She didn't stop, but she felt it, the weight of that room, the small boots placed toe to toe, the cloth rabbit on the shelf. She felt the lodge dying around her, and she felt that room in the same way she felt it, and she made herself keep walking, because the alternative was not something she could afford. Harlan got the east window open. Cold night air hit them hard, the kind of cold that takes your breath for a second, and then you adjust. Below was the east slope steep, snow-covered, dark, a 15-foot drop to the first angled pitch, and then the slope taking you down. "I'll go first," Harlan said, and Ronan last. She didn't argue. Harlan went through feet first, controlled, hit the slope and slid and caught himself against the base of a pine with both forearms. He grunted but held. He looked up and nodded. She went out. The cold of the snow through her clothing was immediate and complete. She slid faster than she expected, the pitch steeper from below than it had looked from above, and she caught the same pine, and her hands burned with cold, but she held. She looked up. Ronan was at the window. Behind him, the upper hallway was orange. She could hear the fire doing things to the structure of the lodge sound she didn't have words for, the language of a building being consumed from inside. "Now," she said. It came out flat and certain because there wasn't room for anything else. He came out. He was heavier, and the snow gave more, and he came down with more force. And she moved, and he caught the pine below her, and for a moment all three of them were pressed against the base of that tree on the east slope, and the lodge above them was burning in full, and the night was lit orange and black in moving patterns, and she could hear men shouting from the front of the property. She made herself not look at the lodge. "The ravine," Harlan said. "We move now before they circle," they moved. Through the timber, the firelight behind them, throwing their shadows long and strange across the snow. She kept the oilskin packet against her chest, and she kept moving, and she focused on the ground in front of her feet, because the ground in front of her feet was what was going to keep her upright. The ravine was 60 feet deep at its center, walls of frozen rock and ice, a winter creek locked in its bed at the bottom. In spring, it drained the east slope efficiently and quietly. In the middle of this particular night, it was a dead end with a stone floor. She knew it when they got into it. She could see the geometry of it in the firelight that was reaching even here, the way the walls narrowed to the south and offered nothing. "We're contained," Harlan said. "I know." Ronan had his rifle up. 1 shot each, maybe 2 if they were careful. Behind them, from the direction of the lodge, the sound of men moving through snow, not running, walking, the deliberate pace of people who know they have time. Then Wycliffe appeared at the lip of the ravine. He stood up there with 2 men flanking him, and he looked down at the 3 of them in the bottom of the icy cut, and his face had the expression she'd seen in the boarding house and in his study, but stripped of everything it had been decorated with. The courtesy gone, the patience gone. What was under those things was smaller and uglier than she'd expected. For a man who'd built an empire, something frightened and furious in equal measure. The look of a man who has spent 30 years making sure he was never exposed and is now completely exposed and cannot absorb the fact of it. He raised his revolver. She felt Ronan felt it before she saw it, the shift of his weight, the intention, and she shoved him sideways with both hands. Hard, he stumbled. Don't, she said. She said it to Wycliffe. He looked at her. His hand was steady. She believed, in that moment, that he had made up his mind entirely, that everything after this would be consequence rather than decision, and that consequence was not something he was currently thinking about. He pulled the trigger. The sound the revolver made was not the sound of a revolver firing. It was a small, flat, mechanical click, the sound of a hammer falling on an empty chamber. Nobody moved. She felt the not moving in her whole body, the frozen second of it, the way time does something strange when it nearly ends and then doesn't. Wycliffe looked at the revolver. His face was entirely wrong, the expression of a man whose certainty has cracked and hasn't yet processed what's underneath the crack. He pulled the hammer back, aimed again at her. Ronan went up the ravine wall. She had thought about this moment afterward many times, and she still couldn't fully explain the physics of it. He was a large man and the wall was icy and steep, and none of that seemed to slow him in any meaningful way. Some situations reduce a person to what they actually are rather than what they present themselves as, and what Ronan actually was, stripped of everything that wasn't essential, was a man who had kept this mountain and everyone on it by sheer obstinate physical will, and that will did not stop to calculate whether the wall was climbable before climbing it. He had a hand on Wycliffe's ankle before Wycliffe had fully processed that he was moving. The two flanking men raised their weapons. Harlan fired. Into the air. One shot, sharp and enormous, bouncing off the ravine walls and doubling and tripling in the stone echo, and every horse tied anywhere on that mountain had an immediate and forceful opinion about the sound. And in the chaos of that, the screaming horses, the flinching men, the second of complete sensory overload, Ronan got over the lip of the ravine and was on his feet. Wycliffe was trying to reload. She could see his hands from below, working the cylinder. The revolver had misfired because the cartridge had been seated wrong. She understood it in that second. A mechanical failure. Not empty, just wrong. And he was correcting it now with the hands of a man whose hands were shaking, but who had enough mechanical knowledge to know what he was doing. He had perhaps 12 seconds. Harlan fired again. This shot was different. The previous one had been a warning, a disruption. This one was aimed. She knew it from the quality of the stillness before Harlan took it, the particular held breath of someone who has done this before and is doing it with intention rather than reaction. Wycliffe went down, not dead. She understood immediately and confirmed later that Harlan had made that choice deliberately, that a man who had spent 11 years as a territorial investigator understood precisely what a conviction required that a corpse did not. The shot took Wycliffe in the right shoulder, and the force of it spun him, and he went down at the ravine's edge, and his revolver went into the snow 2 feet away from him. His two remaining men looked at each other. They looked at Ronan, who was on his feet between them and the ravine, and then they looked at Harlan below, who had reloaded with the efficiency of someone for whom reloading was muscle memory. They looked at their employer on the ground. They dropped their weapons into the snow and raised their hands with a simultaneous movement of two people who have arrived at the same decision by separate routes. Elowen stood at the bottom of the ravine and breathed. She breathed in. She breathed out. She was aware of her heartbeat in a very specific, physical way, aware of it as a sound inside her, a sound that meant she was here, that the last several minutes had not ended differently. She picked up the oilskin packet from where she'd set it in the snow when she'd needed both hands. She held it against her chest, and she let the shaking move through her because it was going to move through her regardless, and there was no point fighting it. It lasted about 80 seconds. Then it stopped. Harlan climbed the ravine wall behind Ronan, with considerably more effort and a commentary under his breath that she decided not to request clarification on. Are you all right? She called up. I'm 68 years old and I just climbed out of an ice hole, he said. No, but I'll recover. Ronan looked over the edge at her. Come up, he said. She went up. The marshal's men arrived by noon. She had sent the Petty brothers' elder brother down the mountain on the fastest horse before the sky had fully grayed, while Ronan and Harlan were securing Wycliffe and his remaining men in the timber operations storage building, with a lock that had been built for equipment and now served an entirely different but not unrelated function. Wycliffe's shoulder wound was serious, and he'd lost blood and was pale and intermittently coherent when the marshals came. And the marshals were professional about it. They'd brought a medical man with them, which Harlan had specifically requested in the message he'd sent, because he knew what a dead defendant did to a conviction, and he wasn't going to let 30 years of the man's crimes be mitigated by a poorly managed shoulder wound. She stood in the yard and watched them load Wycliffe into the transport, and she felt not triumph, not relief, not even the release she'd been expecting. What she felt was smaller and more specific, the particular quiet of a thing finally being done. The way a sound you've been hearing for so long you'd stopped registering it stops, and the absence of it is so complete it almost sounds like something itself. Wycliffe didn't look at her when they brought him past. He looked at the ground in front of his feet. She looked at him fully, because she'd earned the right to look at him, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't see him. But there was nothing she wanted to say. Everything she'd wanted to say was already in the documents, already in the testimony, already in the work. Words spoken at a man in handcuffs don't accomplish anything that the work hasn't already accomplished better. She let him go past. Then she turned around and looked at what was left of the lodge. The lodge was 3/4 gone. The back half had collapsed in the night. The front porch was intact, the door frame still standing with nothing coherent behind it anymore. The stone fireplace rising from the open ruin, the way chimneys always outlast the houses they warmed, which had always seemed to her one of the sadder images in the world, and now seemed like something different. Something stubborn, something that refused to read the situation as a conclusion. She walked through the remains while the morning snow came down, and the marshals were finishing their work in the yard. The debris was still warm in places. The kitchen was rubble. She could see the shape of it under the fallen roof, the cast iron pans buried in ash and timber. She started pulling pans out, one by one, using her gloved hands and a piece of salvaged timber as a lever. They were blackened and one had a crack running through the handle, but they were solid underneath. The way cast iron survives things that have no right to survive. She set them in the yard in a row, 8 of them, and looked at them for a moment. Then she found the picture, the child's drawing in its frame. The glass was gone, and the frame was warped, and the backing was scorched at the edges, but the drawing itself Maeve's green crayon mountains. The lopsided stick figure at the summit had been sandwiched between 2 thick backing boards, and the boards had been thick enough. Barely, but enough. She held it in both hands in the snow and felt something she didn't try to name. The specific weight of something fragile that had been through something that should have destroyed it and hadn't. She went and found Ronan. He was at the edge of the timber yard, looking at the ruins with the expression of a man conducting an internal accounting that had nothing to do with money. She'd seen that expression on him before. She knew what it cost. She held out the drawing. He looked at it for a long time without moving. Then he reached out and took it from her with both hands. The way you take something from someone when you're aware of how easily you could have not been handed it at all. He stood with it in the morning snow. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at his face. That felt like the right call. After a while, he tucked the drawing inside his coat, close against his chest. He looked at the chimney standing alone in the wreckage, the same chimney she'd watched him build around 3 years after his wife and daughter had been killed. The same stones they'd all sat near through a hard winter while they figured out how to be people again. "We'll build around it again," she said. He looked at her. "The chimney's good," she said. "The foundation's good." Most of the timber frame on the north side held. She'd already looked. She'd been looking at it practically since the marshals had arrived, because practical was how she processed things, and she'd accepted that about herself. It'll take time, but it's not starting from nothing. "You already assessed it," he said. Not quite a question. While you were dealing with the transport situation, yes. He looked at the chimney again. Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile, something less finished than a smile. More honest, the expression of a man who has been surprised, again, by a person he should have stopped underestimating months ago. Of course you did, he said. Gideon came out of the bunkhouse with coffee he'd made on the camp stove, moving through the yard with the careful purposefulness of a man who needs to be useful and has found something he can do. He handed cups around without asking. She took hers and held it with both hands, and felt the warmth of it move through her palms and up her arms. She drank it, standing in the snow, looking at the chimney, and she thought, well, now we rebuild. The trial began 6 weeks later in the territorial court, and it was not the clean, swift reckoning that part of her had wanted it to be. It was slow. It was procedural. It had days that felt like erosion. Wycliffe's remaining lawyers were skilled and relentless, and they argued every document with the specific, grinding doggedness of men being paid by the hour to find weakness. There were afternoons where she sat in the gallery and watched the opposing counsel dismantle something she'd spent weeks constructing and had to work very deliberately to remember that dismantling an argument in a courtroom was not the same as dismantling the truth that argument was built on. She'd learned the distinction mattered. She'd also learned it was harder to hold on to than she'd expected. Lavinia Marsh testified on the 4th day. She came into that courtroom the way she entered every room, as if she'd been there before and had already decided her opinion of it. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she talked for 2 hours in the organized, precise way of a woman who had spent 12 years writing things down because she'd known that memory was fallible and documents were not. The courtroom went very quiet by the end of it, the particular quiet of a space-absorbing something that is going to be difficult to recover from if you're on the wrong side of it. Aldous Briggs testified on the 7th day. He sat in the witness chair, and it cost him more visibly than it had cost Lavinia. You could see it, the effort of saying in public and on record what had been done to him. He wasn't eloquent. He stumbled twice and had to be redirected by the prosecutor. But he said it. He put his name to it, and he said it, and the words went into the court record where they would live regardless of anything Wycliffe's lawyers argued afterward. 14 families in total had come forward. Some of the testimony was partial, some documents were incomplete, and a few of the witnesses were clearly frightened even in the relative safety of the courtroom. But taken together and arranged in the sequence that she and Harlan had worked out across weeks of late nights at the kitchen table, it built something that looked, unmistakably, like what it was, a deliberate, decades-long system of theft operated by a man who had used a position of financial trust the way other men used weapons. The bank clerk's deposition was read into the record on the 9th day. He was in the Northern Territory travel inadvisable, his physician had written, and so his notarized statement was read aloud by the court clerk in a flat, procedural voice that somehow made it more devastating rather than less. Wycliffe's lawyers objected to its admission 4 times. They were overruled each time. Harlan testified on the 11th day. He testified as what he actually was, a former territorial investigator with 11 years of field experience and 4 years of documented observation in this specific case. And the opposing counsel spent 40 minutes trying to establish that his methods were irregular and his conclusions predetermined. And Harlan answered every question with the calm of a man who has been cross-examined before and knows that the goal is not to win the argument, but to tell the truth clearly enough that the argument becomes irrelevant. Ronan testified on the 13th day. She watched him take the chair. He sat with his characteristic stillness, the kind that people read differently, depending on what they expected to see. The prosecution saw composure, the defense saw stubbornness, and the jury, she thought, saw something closer to the truth, which was a man who had nothing to perform and nowhere to be except exactly where he was. When the opposing counsel tried to establish him as a hostile mountain recluse with a personal grudge and limited credibility, Ronan looked at the man with the patient expression of someone who has been misread for years and has stopped finding it worth correcting in most circumstances, and then corrected it anyway. "I've lived on that ridge for 8 years," he said. I built the timber operation from raw land. I paid my legitimate debts on schedule for 6 years before the loan terms were modified without my knowledge or consent. I have documentation of that modification and documentation of every payment I made before it." He paused. "I don't know what living on a mountain has to do with any of that." The jury wrote it down. She saw two of them write it down almost simultaneously. She did not testify. This had been the strategy she and Harlan had agreed on. Her involvement was the easiest thing for the defense to attack. Too young, too personally invested, too much standing to gain. The case was strong enough without her voice in it, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is know which room you need to be in and which room you need to stay out of. She sat in the gallery, and she held Lavinia's hand on the difficult days, and she let the process be what it was, which was imperfect and slow and absolutely necessary. The verdict came on the 14th day, guilty on 11 counts of fraud, 3 counts of document falsification, 1 count of conspiracy to commit property theft, 2 counts of direct property theft with aggravating circumstances. She was sitting in the gallery when the foreman read it, and she did not react the way she'd imagined she might. She'd thought she would feel something explosive relief, or triumph, or the specific release of rage that has been stored under pressure for a long time. What she felt instead was the quiet, the particular specific quiet of a thing being finished. The sound a room makes when something that has been wrong in it for a long time is corrected. She looked at Wycliffe. He was looking at the table in front of him. He did not look up. She turned the question over honestly, the way she'd been raised to. Did she feel pity for him? She gave it a real moment. She didn't. What she felt was something closer to the end of a calculation, all the numbers that had been wrong for 30 years, the debts that weren't real, the papers that had been altered, the families that had lost things that couldn't be fully returned, those numbers settling into what they actually were. A final, accurate accounting. She looked away from him. Sentencing came the following week, 12 years in the territorial penitentiary. His financial holdings seized and reviewed. Fraudulent debts identified and canceled through a court-supervised process. Stolen properties to be returned where they could be and compensated where they couldn't. It was not justice in the complete sense. Complete justice would have required returning 12 years of sleep to Lavinia Marsh's husband before his heart broke. It would have required giving Briggs back the 20 years he'd put into a grain operation before it was taken. It would have required doing something about the way certain kinds of damage don't reverse themselves even when the person who caused them is in a cell. She knew that. She'd known it going in. She'd decided, somewhere in the middle of the hard weeks of building the case, that imperfect justice was still justice. The same way an imperfect document is still a document, and an imperfect house is still a house. What mattered was that it was real, and it was done, and it couldn't be undone. She walked out of the territorial courthouse into the November air and stood on the steps for a moment. Harlan came out beside her, then Ronan, then Gideon, who had come for the verdict, who stood on the step above her with his hat in his hands and his eyes red at the edges. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Harlan said, "I want a meal that didn't come out of a courtroom building." And that somehow was exactly right. Frostveil Ridge in spring looked different from the mountain she'd arrived on. Part of it was the season, the amber-green light through timber that had leaves again, the creek running loud and clear along the north property line. But part of it was something that didn't have to do with weather at all. The quality of a place that has been fought for has a different weight than the quality of a place you've simply inherited or been given. She'd noticed it in the first weeks of rebuilding. The lodge going back up wasn't the same lodge coming down in the fire. It was the same stones and some of the same timber, and it sat on the same foundation. But the people who put it back together were different from the people who'd built it originally, and the reasons were different, and that difference lived in the walls. The rebuilding had started in March, and she hadn't expected the help. She'd thought, and Ronan had thought, that they'd be doing it themselves across a long season, using the timber operations income as it came, slow and solitary the way most things had been done on Frostveil Ridge before she'd arrived. What happened instead was that the families began showing up. The Sorensens came first. Two brothers and the older one's teenage boy, with lumber they'd milled on their own property. They arrived on a Tuesday morning without announcement and began laying the foundation of the back wall with the efficiency of people who have decided on something and aren't going to discuss it extensively. The widow Marsh sent money and a set of extremely specific written instructions about the kitchen layout, which Elowen found presumptuous until she realized that the instructions were also correct, at which point she found them useful and implemented them without crediting the source, which she suspected Lavinia would have preferred anyway. Aldous Briggs came with 4 men from the South Valley, and they worked for a week, and Briggs, who had been so ground down when she'd first met him at his cousin's fence post, laughed twice during that week, real laughs. The kind that come out of nowhere when someone around you says something genuinely funny, the kind of laugh that means a person hasn't entirely lost themselves. She heard both of those laughs and felt something loosen in her chest each time. Cale Petty turned out to be unexpectedly skilled at finished carpentry. He built the kitchen shelves, and they were level in a way that the original shelves had not quite been, a fact he did not point out but that she noticed. The lodge came back in stages. Not identical to what it had been, the proportions were slightly different in the back half, and there was new wood alongside old in ways that made the age of the building visible rather than concealed. The way a repaired thing shows its repair honestly. She liked that. She'd never been interested in things that hid what they'd been through. She planted the East Acreage in April, 7 acres. The seedlings came from a nursery in Millhaven. She planted them in rows with enough spacing between them for what they would become in 10 years, not for what they were now, which was small and provisional looking, and not impressive to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Ronan helped her every day she planted. He was not good at it, he was a timberman, oriented toward things that were already large and already growing, not toward the particular patience of starting from small, and he knew he wasn't good at it, and he helped anyway. He got the spacing wrong twice in the first week. She moved the seedlings without commenting on it. He watched her move them. "I'm doing it wrong," he said. "You're learning it," she said. "That's different." He considered that. Not by much, by enough. She knelt and pressed soil around the base of a seedling and looked up at him. "You've been learning things your whole life. You'll learn this too." He knelt down beside her and tried again, more carefully. The spacing was better. They worked through the afternoon in the particular silence that had become their best language. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said enough of the necessary things that what remains doesn't require words to be present. Gideon took the farm back in May. The court had returned it in March. The fraudulent debt being among the clearest cases in the entire proceeding, documented so thoroughly that the opposing counsel hadn't mounted a serious challenge to it. But Gideon spent 2 months before he could make himself go back. She understood without him explaining it. Some places become complicated by what happened in them, and returning to a complicated place requires a kind of preparation that can't be rushed. When he finally went, she went with him. The farmhouse had sat through a hard winter without care. A window on the east side needed boarding up. The south wall, where her mother's climbing roses grew, had gone unchecked since autumn, and the roses had put out long, aggressive canes in every direction, thorny and tangled and very much alive in a way that seemed to have very little to do with anyone's intentions or arrangements. Gideon stood at the edge of his property for a long time and looked at all of it. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be more meaningful than what the place was already saying for itself. He went in eventually, moving through the rooms slowly, the way you move through a place you've been missing, checking whether it's still itself, whether absence changed it, whether it recognizes you back. She stayed outside and worked on the roses, not cutting them back to neat, cutting them back to manageable. She wanted them to keep being what they were, which was her mother's roses, which had survived a winter without anyone looking after them, and come back anyway in their particular shade of pink. Stubborn and specific and entirely indifferent to what the winter had thought of them. Gideon rebuilt that spring with a focused, deliberate energy that was different from his energy before. He was 61, and the weight of what Wycliffe had done was in his face in a way that wasn't going to leave entirely. He was quieter in some ways, more careful in others. But she watched him in the fields from a distance, and she could see the work giving him something back that nothing else had been able to give, the basic physical return of a life that makes its own kind of sense. Soil and seed and time, things that respond honestly to what you put into them. Things that don't renegotiate the terms after you've signed. He and Ronan developed, across several months, the careful, slightly awkward friendship of two men who share almost nothing except that they love the same person and have both learned, through different hard experiences. That love without honesty between the people practicing it is mostly just performance. They went fishing once, together, in 3 hours of nearly unbroken silence, and came back to the farmhouse, and Gideon reported it had been a good afternoon. She asked what they'd talked about. He said not much. She decided that was exactly sufficient. In November, she called a town meeting in Redwater Crossing. She stood in the same church hall where she'd been married in a dress that didn't fit right across the shoulders, and she looked at the people of Redwater Crossing, the farmers and the merchants and the widows and the laborers, the people who had lost things and the people who had watched other people lose things, and the people who had looked away, and the people who hadn't looked away but hadn't done anything either. She didn't talk for long. She'd thought about what she wanted to say for several weeks, and the thinking had been complicated, and the saying of it turned out to be simpler. She said, "What happened in this valley happened because people had known and stayed quiet." She said she wasn't there to make anyone feel guilty guilt that stayed inside. A person was useless. It only became something when it moved, when it changed what you did the next day. She said she wanted to talk about what they were going to do to make sure it couldn't happen the same way again. What structures? What safeguards? What agreements between neighbors that turned out, in the absence of them, to cost so much? Nobody walked out. A few people found the floor interesting. Several people who had been watching other people's farms disappear for years sat in the front rows and nodded before she'd finished her sentences. The answers from the room were imperfect and various and sometimes contradictory. She wrote all of them down, because imperfect and various and contradictory was what an actual community sounded like, as opposed to the smooth, certain language of a man who has decided to speak for everyone while quietly robbing them. A cooperative lending board was established with representatives from 5 affected families. A public record system was proposed that would require loan term modifications to be filed with a neutral county recorder rather than held solely by the lending institution. The circuit judge who had enjoyed Wycliffe's hospitality resigned not under formal pressure, but under the specific quiet pressure of a community that had collectively stopped behaving as if his relationship with Wycliffe were a secret. These were not complete solutions. She knew that. She'd stopped expecting complete solutions. Around the same time, she'd stopped expecting clean justice, which was when she'd understood that the world was not built to offer those things, but could sometimes be persuaded, with enough work and enough people, to offer something close enough to them that the difference was bearable. She and Ronan married again in September, under the pines at the east edge of the property where the young apple trees stood in their rows. There was no church, no ceremony in the formal sense. Harlan was there, the Petty brothers, Lavinia, who had traveled up the mountain with the expression of a woman who found physical travel inconvenient, but had decided this occasion outweighed the inconvenience. Gideon, who cried freely and without apology, which was new, which she found she loved. They said what they wanted to say in their own words, which were not the words of people practiced at speaking this kind of thing in public. Ronan said he'd spent 3 years convincing himself that keeping the mountain was enough, that purpose was a reasonable substitute for the things he'd lost, and that the year since her arrival had made that argument impossible to maintain. She said she'd come to Frostveil Ridge with a list of problems to solve, and the working assumption that solving them was how she'd eventually earn her way out, and that somewhere in the middle of it she'd stopped wanting out, which had surprised her considerably. It was not poetry. It was true, which she'd decided long ago was worth more. The September light came through the pines at the particular angle it came at that time of year, and the apple trees stood in their rows, and the rebuilt lodge was visible through the timber, the chimney solid and familiar against the sky. She looked at him and thought about the woman who had ridden up this mountain with a survival plan and a borrowed dress, and a list of strategies for making herself tolerable to a man everyone had told her was dangerous. She thought about that woman with the recognition you feel for a version of yourself that had to be exactly what it was in order for you to become the next thing. She had not been sent here to be saved. She'd understood that from the first night, the key in her hand and the decision to use it. She'd been sent here to be used, and she'd refused the use. And the refusing had changed everything, not because refusing was heroic, but because it was the only thing left that was entirely hers, and she'd held on to it. Harlan retired officially that autumn and stayed on the ridge, which surprised no one who knew him, and which he explained by saying he had nowhere better to be, which was true in the practical sense, and only partly the whole story. He helped with the timber operation and taught Cale Petty the accounting, and sat on the porch on warm evenings, with a coffee he claimed was medicinal, and occasionally told stories about his investigator years that were funny, in retrospect, and probably hadn't been at the time. He was a different presence on the ridge than he'd been in the years before. The truth of him was known lighter, she thought, the way people get lighter when they stop carrying a concealment. He and Ronan had their conversation about the 4 years of watching and not telling. She wasn't there for it. She hadn't asked to be, and Ronan hadn't suggested it. What she saw afterward was Ronan's face settling into something that wasn't entirely
reconciled, but was functional enough that things could continue. And she'd come to believe that was what most forgiveness actually looked like in practice.
Not the clean resolution of everything, but the decision to keep going with what remained. The apple trees bore fruit in September of their 3rd year. Small fruit, tart young trees don't give you much, and what they give is unfinished, the sweetness not yet fully developed. But they were there, real, solid living things that had been planted in specific soil by specific hands on a specific piece of land that had been contested and protected and nearly lost and rebuilt around. She picked the first one herself in the morning when the air had the crystalline quality of early fall, the kind that makes you feel like you're seeing everything slightly more clearly than usual. She brought it to Ronan at the edge of the orchard. He bit into it, chewed, made a small face tart, he said. It'll be sweeter next year. He looked at her. You always say that about things. Because it's generally true, she said, given time. He looked at the rows of trees. She watched him look at them, not with the particular weight he used to carry. When he looked at this part of the property, the weight of something started with someone else and never finished. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that is simply, currently, his. Something he has tended and watched and is watching still. A sound from the porch, small feet on wood boards. Wren appeared at the railing in the full body, determined way of a 2-year-old who has decided the outside is more interesting than the inside and is going to make this known. She looked at the orchard. She looked at her parents. She looked at the apple in her father's hand with the calculating interest of a small person who has recently understood that adults sometimes share what they're holding. Tree, she said, pointing. That's right, Elowen said. Wren considered the trees for a moment with the deep seriousness of someone forming an opinion. Then she looked at her father with an expression that communicated the apple situation clearly. Ronan looked at Elowen. She had thought over the years since about what she saw in his face at that moment. She tried to find the right word for it and never quite landed on one. It wasn't happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. It was something more specific, the quality of a man who has spent years braced for loss, who has built his entire internal posture around the anticipation of losing things, and who is very slowly, very carefully, learning to stop bracing. Learning that the present moment is allowed to be real, that it does not have to be held loosely against the possibility of its taking. It was not a finished quality. There were still nights she woke and heard him in the hall. There were still things he didn't say that she could see him not saying. He was not fixed, and she had never expected him to be fixed, because fixed was not a state people reached. It was a word people used when they didn't want to say ongoing or working at it or some days better than others. But he was present. He kept showing up. And she'd decided, in the accumulated evidence of the year since she'd arrived on this mountain and all the years since, that showing up was not a lesser form of commitment. It was the form, the actual substance of it, the only version of love that was real rather than decorative. She went and lifted Wren from the railing and carried her into the orchard between the rows of young trees. She pointed out the fruit. Let the small hands touch the smooth skin of an apple. Explained in the simple vocabulary of talking to someone who is learning that the world has a logic, how a tree worked, what it needed, how long it took to give you what it had been growing toward. Wren listened with the selective attention of a 2-year-old, which meant she absorbed some of it and stored the rest somewhere she'd retrieve on her own schedule. She said tree and apple and a word that might have been her own word for something that didn't have a name yet, and she reached for the apple in Ronan's hand. He gave it to her, and she bit into the tart small flesh of it and wrinkled her nose. Elowen laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the fullness of it, the way it came out before she decided to. She laughed, and Ronan looked at her, and something in his face answered it. Not a laugh. Something quieter, but in the same register. And Wren looked between them with the expression of a child who knows the adults are happy and has decided to accept this. They stood in the orchard in the September light, and the ridge was around them, the timber. The creek, the rebuilt lodge with its honest record of repair visible in the grain of it, the chimney that had outlasted the fire and been built around again. The valley below was Redwater Crossing, which was not fixed either, but was different, the cooperative board meeting monthly, the records open, the families on their properties, the long, slow work of a community deciding what it owed to itself. She thought about all the things that had been required for this moment to be possible. The list was long, and not all of it was things she was proud of or things she'd chosen. Some of it was luck, and some of it was other people's courage, and some of it was the specific accident of Wycliffe being arrogant enough to use her as a tool, without considering what happened when a tool decided not to be one. She thought about the 19-year-old girl on the horse 4 years ago, riding up a mountain road she'd never traveled, holding herself very still and very carefully while the town watched from below. That girl had not been naive. She'd known exactly how bad it was. She'd just decided that knowing how bad it was did not obligate her to stop. That was the thing she'd carry. Not the trial, not the testimony, not the specific victories over a specific man. The simpler thing underneath all of it, that you don't protect a life by waiting for someone to finish threatening it. You protect it by deciding it is yours, by planting things in it that belong to you. By staying when the staying is hard and understanding that the staying, more than any single act of courage or resistance, is what makes a place real. Frostveil Ridge was real. She'd made it real. They'd made it real. With the families who'd showed up with lumber on Tuesday mornings, and the woman who'd sent instructions about kitchen shelves, and the old investigator sitting on the porch with his medicinal coffee, and the man beside her who had kept this mountain for years by sheer will and learned. Eventually, that will alone is not enough, that at some point you have to open the locked door and plant the orchard and let the present be present. The apple trees would be sweeter next year. She knew this with the certainty of someone who had learned to trust slow things, things that grow in soil that's been fought over and won and settled into, things that ask only for time and ground and someone willing to keep showing up. Between the rows, her daughter ran with both arms out for balance. The way children run when the ground is uneven and they haven't fully figured out their own legs yet, full of speed and confidence and the magnificent, unearned conviction that the world is interesting and they are welcome in it. Ronan Blackwood was growing up on land that could never be used as payment for someone else's debts. Elowen watched her run and felt the weight of that and let it be exactly what it was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.